Hey, everybody, welcome to the Scale Trains YouTube channel. I'm Drayton Blackgrove, and I'm joined here today by my good friend Arthur Bradley. You might know him from Bradley DCC Custom Models, but you might not know that this guy here has been a Rio Grande modeler for probably half of his life at this point. And I couldn't think of anybody better to talk to about Rio Grande GP40s. And for those of you who don't know, the latest run of Rivet Counter GP40s in HO scale are in stock now. We have a wide range of road numbers available for you classic Rio Grande modelers. And I just wanted to talk to Arthur today a little bit about the prototypes, what makes them special. But before we get into the GP40, Arthur, I want to know a little bit more about your story. How did you get into modeling the Rio Grande? I know that you never grew up in that area. So what attracted you to the Rio Grande? And most importantly, how old were you at the time? Because I think it's really important for people to understand that.
Yeah, I think when I started modeling the Rio Grande, it was probably about when I was age 12, I would say, which is around the time that I started doing my custom model work. And it just really fell from a love of watching videos and seeing pictures. And I I didn't get the chance to go to Colorado and see some of these places in person until probably about 4 or 5 years ago. I made a pilgrimage out there and I got to check out the Moffat Tunnel and the now abandoned Tennessee Pass Line, which I modeled. And back in the day, there was not really the level of models that you get like nowadays from Rivet Counter series that had all the lights and the paint schemes and all the details accurate. It was just generic, out of the box models. So my business grew from a need of me wanting models that weren't available, so I had to make them myself. And then that trickled into building models for members of my model railroad club. And then I eventually got into mail order and made a website and stuff.
So the Rio Grande locomotives, that goes like, how did you get interested in Rio Grande? Did you see them in magazines or railroad books or things like that?
I think it was a combined love of the scenery. I'm a big fan of Colorado and just love the scenery and the mountain tunnels. And I mean, when you look at the photos of where this railroad ran through, I mean, there's not much not to love, you could say. I mean, when you have, I don't know, 29 tunnels and 50 miles and massive bridges and rock cuts and canyons, it's just like, give me more of that.
Yeah, about as close to heaven on earth as it gets. Just out of curiosity, what was the first custom Rio Grande model you ever built?
I just saw this the other day because I was doing a quick Google search and it came up, and it was a GP60, I believe, was one of the first ones that I did my own LED work on and added ditch lights and like a snowplow and emu hoses and stuff to match the prototype. And actually, one of the early models I did, which I did for an article in the Rio Grande Modeling and Historical Society's magazine called The Prospector that I wrote when I was 16, was a GP30 model, which at the time was a generic body style. I think it's the style of Burlington route. Has a nose light, but it's too low. And I went through how I super detailed it and added lights and sound, and that was one of those models that I did pretty early on.
Now, I know that you kind of got away from doing Rio Grande. Why did you kind of decide not to stick with Rio Grande, and then what brought you back into it?
Well, initially I fell in love with the photos and videos, but I think what I was missing was the personal connection. Since I was born after Rio Grande ceased to exist, I never got to see anything like that in person. So I had a large Rio Grande roster and collection. And when I moved out east to Virginia, I got to see some of the CSX through like West Virginia. And, it was kind of similar mountain coal railroading. And I got to see that in person. And then later some on Norfolk Southern. And I kind of shifted to, because I like modeling what I see. And it's a little bit easier to model something you've seen in person than maybe just going on photos alone. So I kind of left Rio Grande behind and went to modeling modern. And then I would say probably around 4 or 5 years ago or so, a good friend of ours, shout out to Michael, convinced me to purchase a model off eBay when we were out camping, and I got it. They've been trickling in it ever since, and it's kind of a passion or an obsession, you could say, that's kind of hard to stop once you get started.
Yeah,
and
I know
it's really.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's really been a great time to get back into it. It wasn't the reason I got back into it, but just right about as soon as I hit the go switch on going back to Rio Grande, that's when all this cool stuff started coming out from Scale Trains, the GB30s, the GP40s, the SD45s, now the SD40 T-2s coming out. It's like I could have everything I could ever want for my roster.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was actually going to be my next question. I know from our conversations that you've kind of described this as being like the golden era of Rio Grande modeling. And for those who are not familiar with Rio Grande, why would you say that? Like, Rit Counter, I think, really changed the game in our hobby in many different ways. But like, if you could maybe talk about how it changed the game for Rio Grande modelers, specifically, maybe when it comes to lighting, that could be one point of discussion there.
Yeah, it's all about the details and the quality. What Rio Grande models were available at the time were just lower quality detailed. So I was still able to model Rio Grande. In fact, at one time, I think I had upwards of 100 locomotives, but every single one I had to add all the details: the snow plows, emu hoses, coupler cut levers, horns in the right place. I cut so many SD50 noses that didn't come with the gyrolight in there, and I cut it out with a knife and a drill and a file, and I would insert the Details West, nose gyrolight. And I did that so many times that I could probably do it blindfolded now. And I'm so glad that I don't have to do that anymore, and I can focus my efforts more towards the like weathering and stuff like that.
Sure. Yeah, no, I can only imagine how monotonous that would get after a while, especially with someone like you, that it seems like your mission is to acquire every single diesel locomotive Rio Grande had in a certain time period, at least one on your roster. Yeah. So what was the first Scale Trains Rio Grande locomotive that you added to your roster?
The GP30s. I got a couple of those. And then everything when I got back into Rio Grande, it was right after the original tunnel motors came out. So I missed out on those. And I'm like, dang it, I should have grabbed some of those. And lo and behold, a few years later, now here we're getting a new run that's going to be better than ever. So I've got all of those ordered. But yeah, it was the GP30s and then the SD45s and the GP40s here recently. Sure.
Yeah. And kind of like what you mentioned, this run being better than ever. Our early runs of the tunnel motors did not have walkway lights or ground lights, and now this latest run is going to come with those LED lighting effects as well, which is really exciting. I mean, like you said earlier, the lighting is a big deal, and it's just amazing to see that continually evolve. And I guess it sort of does revolve if you're talking about Rio Grande with the gyro lights.
The next thing we need to figure out is HO scale shrunk down, actually moving, lighting optics in the nose. Let's see if we can make that happen, huh?
Man, yeah, that would be quite the challenge. And it's amazing too, like in modern railroading, like just seeing railroads transition from incandescent bulbs to actual LEDs. It's kind of interesting how they do that, because they do them in clusters. And we're actually trying to look into ways of being able to actually do that or simulate that on modern locomotives. But as far as Rio Grande goes, one thing I've noticed about the railroad is it kind of went through the entire life cycle of EMD, from the SD. Did they have SD7s or was it just SD9s? I can't remember off the top of my head.
They had both, yeah.
They had both. Okay, so going back to the transition era all the way until the very end with GP60s, like They had it. They had it all. Not as many railroads had that
They
much variety. You know.
they were definitely a solid EMD railroad, except in the very very early days they had a few Baldwin, a few Alcos, just a few, but basically everything from like GP7s onward was all EMD, and then like they said, they had basically everything in the second generation up to the beginning of the third generation with the GP60, which was the last new locomotives that they ordered.
Yeah, yeah. Now, the time period that you model, what exact era is that with Rio Grande?
I try and shoot for around early to late 80s. That kind of spans the era where there was a little bit of mix through and run through power, but it was still primarily Rio Grande power. They were still using cabooses, although the windows were plated out. And then that kind of like shifts into late 80s, early 90s, and you started getting some leasers and some mixed SP and some stuff coming in there. So I kind of have a bit of a range, but I would say 1984 is around a pretty solid guess of where I would be at.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, this podcast is titled All About GP40s. So I want to know a little bit about the GP40s and how they fit into the era that you model. What were the GP40s primarily assigned to? Where did they run and how are they used?
I mean, at the time, they're pretty much, as the name would guess, general purpose. They could be used on anything from manifest freights, and then later in their life, they were moved more towards like helper service. It's interesting, you would see more so on the joint line and the Moffett line, they would use more of the tunnel motors and ST50s and 6-axle power. On the Tennessee Pass, being a secondary line, they kind of got the leftovers. So a lot of times you would see on these 100-car unit coal trains, they would be led by a pack of up to 7 SC40T-2 tunnel motors, but in the middle would be a solid pack of 10 Jeeps. I mean, we're talking GP30s, GP35s, the early phase GP40s, the late phase GP40s, and the GP40-2s. Just 7 to 10 of those guys, just all together.
The sound must have been unbelievable.
Unbelievable. Yeah. Around 55,000 horsepower to lift 100 cars over that grade.
You were telling me off camera a while ago that the GP40s, some of them were used as B units. What's that all about?
Yeah, so I believe it was in 1974. Rio Grande converted, I think, about 56 units, GP30s, GP40s, and all the GP35s to B unit status. So the latter half of the GP30s, I think 3020 through 3028, the early phase GP40s, so not the ones that just came out in scale trains rivet counter, but the earlier ones, and then all the GP35s. And they did that primarily as like maintenance and like cost saving. They removed radios, toilets, and cab seats, and you could they weren't plated out or they weren't labeled B unit. So really the only way that you would notice it, if you notice the lack of a radio antenna, would be the windows would basically just be black from soot because they wouldn't be cleaned because no one went in those units. And those were just basically when they ran those massive helper sets of multiple units, they didn't need functioning radios and toilets and everything in every single unit, just one on each end. Kind of similar logic to like a F unit A, B, B, A set.
Sure. So just because I'm not as familiar with Rio Grande, I know on the Southern Railway, they had to have these remote box cars. I actually have a model of one on my desk here. And because they didn't have like distributive power like how we have today. Were those helper units on Rio Grande, were those manned or were those radio powered? I would imagine with the tunnels, that was probably challenging.
It was manned, yeah. So
okay.
all the helper sets were manned. So they would be in one of the lead locomotives that was an A unit status locomotive, and they would be controlling all the B units immued behind it manually. So hypothetically, you could have a GP40 A unit
one of the ones that we're offering in this run. These were, like you said, always were used as A units, followed by 5 or 6 of the B units, and then perhaps another A unit for the return trip.
Correct. Yeah, and that was somewhat temporary. The B units some of them were returned to A unit status after the merger with SP. I believe most of the GP40s were returned to A unit status, but the older GP30s and 35s were not.
Okay, cool. So I wanted to ask you about some of the unique features of the Rio Grande GP40s. Like for instance, what makes a Rio Grande GP40 special, say, compared to like an L&N or a Chesapeake in Ohio? What are some of those road-specific details that a modeler who is really serious, a rivet counter modeler, would want to see in a Rio Grande GP40?
I mean, probably the thing that's going to grab you right away is the nose Mars light. And early Rio Grande units utilized a Mars light. Later units, like I think the last run of Tunnel Motors, utilized a Pyle gyro light, which had a slightly different flashing pattern and whatnot. But yeah, definitely that nose light, which kind of goes back to what I was saying with the original models that I, excuse me, that I had to work with back in, 15 some years ago, did not have gyro lights. So in addition to the SD50s, I remember GP35s, GP40s. I mean, I was working with different brands of models, and I would have to sand and file and drill and cut and put in that nose. And that was like, once you had the gyro light in the nose, that was like, okay, now it's a Rio Grande locomotive. And the only units that didn't have that were, they actually got a batch of GP40s that they purchased from Conrail in the 1980s. And those units were painted a slightly darker orange, and they never received nose gyro lights. So that was definitely like a telltale factor. If you saw one of those coming down the track and it just had the headlight, you'd be like, oh, wasn't built for Rio Grande. And some of the units, some of the units, like I recently found a photo of one of the SD50s were shipped from EMD without gyro lights. And I think they were on Rio Grande for maybe, I don't know if they ever saw service. They were shopped in Denver at their own shops, and they basically cut in because that order was originally destined for chassis system. And they grabbed it, purchased it, and then modded it basically to Rio Grande specs. But on the GP40s, aside from that, you would get your trademark Nathan M3 horn. That was definitely a Rio Grande feature, along with the re-rail frogs that would hang from the rear of the unit. All Rio Grande units had those.
Got it. And were there 2 types of re-rail frogs or just one? I know I read somewhere that there was like an early and a late style re-rail frog.
There is, yeah. So the style that is on the GP40, the rivet counter one that just came out, that is the early style. So that's accurate for 1970s. In late 70s, early 80s, they swapped those out to a different style.
Are you going to have to modify your units at all to fit your era?
I am. I actually have a couple units here on my workbench. I recently finished one of the GP40s that is absolutely perfectly detailed, except that it's for the 70s era, not the 80s era. So this is one of those models, and it has the early style re-rail frogs, and it also has the early style coupler cut levers that have just the bottom lever and not the top loop. And then this is one of the models that I recently completed, custom weathered.
Wow, look at that.
And it has the late style re-rail frog compared to the early style. And it also has the late style coupler cut levers, which I swapped from another unit. But yeah, you can see the difference in the weathering there. By the mid 80s, these things were pretty heavily done.
I'd say so.
Yeah. And they couple neat features that are kind of grand specific weathering details are the nose of the model right here would often be clean because of the crew coming in and out of the cab of the locomotive. Their bags and their sleeves would wear off the soot on the nose. So when you would see these really dirty models, a lot of times the side of this nose here was clean. So that's a spotting detail that you can notice. And the other thing is, I don't know if it ever got an official railfan term, but I like to call it the Rio Grande burn, the dynamic brake burn. And that's where the dynamic brakes, because I mean, this is a mountain railroad with 2 to 3% grades. They were working those dynamic brakes all day long, every day, and it generated so much heat. I mean, this is second generation EMD, a little bit before some of the modern heat shield technology and cooling and fans and stuff. They just baked. I mean, so the top of the Rio Grande and the G would just be like burnt off. And you can see here on the other side.
Unreal. See, and that's the thing, like as a manufacturer, it's really important to find photos of Rio Grande units that are clean, because
it's hard to do sometimes.
Well, yeah, it's hard to do sometimes, but like you to be able to make the models at a rivet counter level, you have to be able to see which doors, which engine cab doors the lettering was located on. And it's really hard to do that when you have a locomotive that you can't even read the lettering on. Yeah. Sometimes they would just turn into something that looks closer to NS with just full black paint. Yeah. Well, and I think weathering is so important. Like, for collectors, I can understand wanting to have a locomotive that looks factory fresh, but I think Rio Grande is one of those unique railroads where the weathering just really takes it to a whole new level. And Arthur, you're going to have to send us some detailed photos of your models, maybe some video. If you want to send us over some video, we'll overlay the clips and the photos over the podcast so people can see the models better. But man, that's really, really cool to see. So when you finally get your fleet of GP40s ready, do you have a place that you can run them?
I don't have a personal layout yet. I'm just in the stages of amassing my roster, but there is a local layout near me here in Montana that has some really amazing scenery, and parts of it can look pretty close to the Tennessee Pass line if you film it from certain angles. So I was just operating there last week, and I definitely enjoy taking my models there.
So one day when you get to put together your dream Rio Grande layout, is there a specific branch line or main line that you want to model, or are you going to just do the actual main line itself through Moffett?
I've always preferred the line over Tennessee Pass. I like the scenery there, the helper operations, the curves, the grade. It's a really unique part of the railroad. But I do think it would be nice to include some other sections of the Rio Grande, because the Tennessee Pass line was mostly a bridge line. Every train had helper service. There was only a handful of industries along the line. So I think it could be cool to do like maybe the Tennessee Pass section in the middle, and then maybe part of the joint line Pueblo area that had a lot more industry on one end, just to make it more interesting from an operating standpoint, over Tennessee Pass and then into Utah, some of the amazing sand desert landscapes out there. Such a variety of scenery that you get on the Rio Grande.
Yeah. Now, did the GP40s last into the acquisition of Southern Pacific? Like, did they stay on the Rio Grande roster through the 90s, or did they phase them out?
No, they were well used through the 90s. I mean, even some of the GP30s, 2 or 3 of the GP30s made it, and they're worn out, plated nose gyro lights. They have ditch lights added. I saw a photo of one of the Rio Grande GP40s lashed up with an SP GP40 M-2 pulling a work train like in 98. I mean, and then eventually I think some of them got patched into UP, and then they were phased out in the early 2000s. But, considering they were built, late 60s, early 70s. That was quite a long career.
Yeah, they definitely got their money's worth out of them. And since you mentioned GP30s, I wanted to show everybody on camera our cute, well, and of course I've got it the wrong side. I took the foam out of the handrails just to show it in this video podcast here, but of course I show the wrong side. But this is the Rio Grande GP30 in N scale, and Arthur's got the HO scale version. So it's pretty cool to be able to see this same level of detail from the HO model and the N scale model. We've had a lot of folks really excited about these. I'll show you the long head end as well. One thing to note is that the GP30s are our first 4-axle locomotive in HO scale and in N scale. So we get a lot of requests all the time to do Rio Grande. It's honestly one of the most popular road names. And one of our founders, excuse me, Paul Ellis, is a Western Railroad modeler. He's a Southern Pacific guy. But as you know, there was a lot of integration between the SP and the Rio Grande in the 90s. And so if you're an SP guy, you really need some Rio Grande locomotives too. And
how about the little known fact that Rio Grande actually bought SP, not the other way around?
Yeah. And that's why I was strategic about what I said earlier, because most people don't know that.
Yeah. Hence, SP speed lettering is Rio Grande font. And basically, Anschutz Industries that owned Rio Grande purchased SP, but kept their corporate image because they were technically the larger railroad. But I think that says a lot that Rio Grande, that only had lines in 2 states, bought SP, which have lines from Washington to California and across to Texas and all over the Southwest.
I think they went all the way to New Orleans. I think that was as far east as they went. So that's crazy.
Yeah, if you count the Cotton Belt.
Oh yeah,
Southwestern. Yeah.
Yep, Cotton Belt too. Yeah, that's incredible to think about. So another thing I wanted to mention for our viewers here who are thinking about getting these GP40s. First of all, you're going to want to get these numbers because the inventory is getting low. Also, these road numbers, like we mentioned, were always A units. We're going to do future runs that are going to be the B unit road number series. We'll probably also do some more A units as well. But, for modelers who aren't as into customizing their models, like myself, if I look at it the wrong way, it's going to break. Arthur knows a thing or two about that. He's fixed quite a few of my models for me over the years. But if you're a little nervous about customizing your locomotives, the good news is we'll have some 80s and 90s versions of Rio Grande GP40s in the future. But, one thing that we try to do is space out how often we release the same road names. Because let's be honest, Arthur, what has all these Rio Grande releases done to your budget?
Emptied my wallet. I'm getting hit for GP40s, SD45s, and tunnel motors within a 2-month window, 2 to 3 month window.
Yeah. So
not to mention everything else Rio Grande that's coming out this year.
Yeah, I mean, just across the hobby as a whole, it's amazing to see in the other manufacturers out there too that are coming out with stuff. So I think that you picked the best time possible to get back into modeling Rio Grande, and I'm really excited to see what you do. And just want to say thank you for being a longtime Scale Trains customer and a great close personal friend of mine. For those who don't know, Arthur originally was living in Indiana, and now he lives in Montana because he loves those mountains. I never get to see him anymore, but just know that you're missed and you're loved. And like I said, can't wait to see what you do with your Rio Grande modeling. So thanks for joining us here on the podcast today, Arthur.
Thanks for having me.
All right, we'll talk to you soon. Make sure you send us those pictures.
All right, will do.
All right, buddy. See ya.